So just a quick update. Since I applied this talk or submitted this talk, I've actually changed jobs. So that's why you see White Knight Labs here. So it originally said that I was the red team lead at UPMC. I'm actually the offensive security director of offensive operations at White Knight Labs. So that's why you see all the White Knight Labs branding and the T-shirt and everything there. So anyways, my talk today is on weaponizing vulnerable drivers to attack EDRs. And so like many of us in the network penetration testing realm or red teaming realm, I kind of started off my career with OffSec and the OSCP. And in the OSCP labs, at least in the mid-2010s when I started my journey, you would be in a lab with like Windows 2000 and like some Debian system from 2008 and so forth. And there were old systems and there was absolutely zero defensive measures or AV or anything like that on the systems. Passed my OSCP, got into the real world and got my butt kicked by CrowdStrike and Cortex and SentinelOne and so forth, because you start loading Mimikatz on a system and you're going to get scrubbed really quickly and you're going to get a lot of alerts from the blue team. And so that caused me to dive deeper and deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. And so a couple years ago, I saw a talk. I wish I could remember who it was, but it was some guy from Australia, and he was talking about kernel notification callbacks that EDRs leverage, and he showed removing them and the impact on the system, and I was mesmerized by the power of that. And so that led me into a journey of kernel and driver vulnerability research and exploit development for the purpose of red team operations and attacking EDRs. So basically, all I want as an administrator on a local system is complete and utter unfettered access to it, right? I don't want these pesky EDRs stopping me from doing what I want to do, right? If I want a payload on there, I just want the payload to run. And so we got to attack the EDR to do that without having to make a custom payload for every single instance. So it's not just me. Attackers have had a lot of difficulty as well, right? And they've been resorting to kernel land attacks through vulnerable drivers. You see a lot of articles from CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, ESET, and so forth. Here's just a quick sampling here. Really quick, before I go any further, I actually thought this was a 40 or 45-minute talk, and so last week I was like, oh, I've got to cut out like half the slides, so you'll see me blitz through a couple of these slides, and that's why. But anyways, the attackers are resorting to vulnerable drivers to accomplish the same goals. Instead of my purposes as a red teamer, they're wanting to spread ransomware and there are other more destructive forms of malware. And so disabling and attacking the EDR and kernel level is a really good way to spread ransomware unfettered. And just like any good, just like any new wave of techniques and attacks, the blue teamers do what blue teamers do, and they have an LOL project for it. So there's LOL drivers, which is essentially a database of vulnerable or potentially vulnerable or known exploited third-party drivers, and sometimes native drivers as well. And so basically it's just a database online that you can reference, and it's a really great resource for kernel or driver exploit development and research as well. So just a quick who am I already said my job title and so forth. So I do a lot of research and development, which is this kind of stuff, right? And then I do operations with red team engagements, web app pen tests, fat client pen tests, infrastructure pen tests, all that kind of stuff. And then I do a lot of teaching and content dev too. So a lot of the techniques and just the content of this course is covered in our offensive development course that we taught a couple days ago at NorthSec. So if you want like 10 hours of this content in expanded form with code and all that kind of stuff, that's kind of where we really dive deep into it. It's not meant to be a sales pitch, just it's relevant. We already talked about my certifications and nobody really cares. So the contents that we'll talk about today, I'm going to kind of blitz through OS architecture review because we just don't have a lot of time to cover it in depth. So bear with me as I try to like cover that at a really high level. We'll just talk about like basically user versus kernel mode, and then EDR architecture, and most exclusively kernel mode. We're really just going to focus on kernel mode today because there's just a million other resources on user mode and so forth with function hooking DLLs and all that kind of stuff. So we're just going to focus on kernel just to scope the discussion. Then we're going to move on to exploitation for EDR evasion and how we can use kernel exploits or driver exploits. When I'm going to say kernel exploits, really it's not just for the Windows kernel, but it's also for like a driver that's running in kernel mode. So if I don't say driver, kernel just covers everything. But anyways, we'll talk about vulnerabilities that could give us interesting power in attacking the EDR. And then we'll do a demo with CrowdStrike and Falcon. There's no particular reason I chose CrowdStrike. I've tested it on a bunch of different EDRs. It's just the 800-pound gorilla in the industry, right? And so everybody knows Falcon. And so we're going to do a demo with these techniques on that. And then we'll talk about defense and what SOC teams and defenders can do to defend against this type of attack. Okay, so real quick, OS architecture review. I'm terrible with slides, just threw a couple things here. User mode versus kernel mode. User mode is typically referred to as ring 3. Kernel is ring 0. Another side note, this is all Windows x86. So that's, again, the scope of the discussion. So there's user and kernel mode. Ring 0 is the privileged core of the OS, right? So memory management, scheduling, TCP/IP, security enforcement, all that kind of stuff is done in kernel mode. We don't see any of that, right? Ring 3 is where we live for the most part, unless you're a kernel developer or a driver developer. If you're clicking anything, if you're running a command prompt as administrator, if you're a power user on a system, you're still all going to be in user mode, right? Kernel mode does all the stuff under the hood, so we don't actually have to deal with a lot of memory management. That's going to be done from the kernel. Same thing with like dealing with interactions with hardware and all that kind of stuff. I like to think of it in terms of web APIs because a lot of us in security or technology in general kind of just, you hear a kernel and you're just like, okay, I just don't really want to think about that too much. But I like to simplify it because web APIs is something that a lot of us connect with and understand really well. So I like to think of user mode as like the client. So sending like a web request as the client, and then kernel mode as the API server. And so as the user mode client, you're going to send a request just like an API request with arguments and session data, all that kind of stuff. And then the server is going to see that. It's going to perform an operation on the back end that's opaque to the user, and then return whatever the result is from that specific request. So on the right here, you see I have the N64 emulator. So if you have a program running that's an N64 emulator because you want to see you want to run Ocarina of Time ROM hack or something like that, and you want to create a window for your Ocarina of Time ROM so that it starts running it, and you see that very nostalgic splash screen of Legend of Zelda. To create that window, you're going to run a create window API. Eventually, it will sync to a syscall that's going to have information about like the size of the window and all that kind of stuff. And then it will send that syscall to the kernel mode, basically like the API. And then the kernel is actually going to create that object in kernel mode, and it's going to have a reference to it. And it is an opaque reference or obscured reference in kernel mode that it returns to the user, which is a handle. And so then the user mode has a reference to that window in user mode that it can then destroy or do whatever it needs to do with that window, and it can reference it by the handle. So yeah, so that's just a quick review of some topics that we'll be covering a little bit more. There's the Windows kernel, right? The NTOS kernel.exe image that's going to be loaded. So that's the actual kernel image. But then there's kernel drivers, which are typically .sys files. And they're also portable executable. They're just a little bit different. It's the same file type. But they're interacted with slightly differently. Typically, there's IRPs, input-output request packets, and you pretty much send a control code that will hit a certain code path in the driver as on kind of the server-side API, so to speak, using our analogy. And then you send a buffer of data, which will essentially be the arguments or the data that you want to send to it. So it's oversimplified. We could spend 4 or 5 hours talking just about this or more, but that's a fairly good overview. Okay, so this is all the user mode stuff that I'm skipping. If you want to talk more about user mode hooks and stuff like that, we can definitely do that. So we're just going to skip straight to kernel mode. So at this point, we're pretty much all aware, after July of last year, pretty much the entire world is aware, right, that EDRs have kernel mode components, kernel drivers. What happened in July of last year? The world died because CrowdStrike pushed out a bad channel file update. So it's kind of interesting. It kind of relates to some of the topics that we'll talk about today. I'll just do a quick aside. They wanted to get around some signing requirements to push out more agile updates, basically. And so they did that by pushing out these channel files that are referenced by the kernel driver. And so the kernel driver referenced a channel file, and it had an invalid memory access, essentially, and then it crashed. And if you crash in kernel mode, you get a bug check or a blue screen of death. And so that's essentially what happened. Again, oversimplifying a lot of things here. But anyways, so in kernel mode, there's certain protections in place. The only one we'll really talk about is process protection, or PPL. So how many have tried to dump LSAS and failed because of PPL? A bunch of hands. Okay, so many of you will be aware of that protection then. So in Windows 11, and you can manually configure this in Windows 10, by default, Windows is going to run LSAS, by default in Windows 11, and you can configure it in Windows 10, LSAS is going to be run as PPL. And so basically what that means is if you have process 1, let's say that's LSAS, is running as system with a PPL setting, and then you have process 2, let's say it's malware, running as system, but there's no PPL status. Even though they're both running as system, process 2, the malware process, can't read, write, terminate, do anything to the other process because there's additional kernel mode kernel mode protections in place. And so you have to have a PPL status of equal or higher to actually impact that other process. So that's just a relevant protection that's in place, because if we try to, like, say, kill, I'm just going to keep picking on CrowdStrike, but kill the Falcon process that's running as an agent in the background, it's going to fail, even if we're running a system, right? Because it's going to be protected by this PPL status. So moving on from protections, that's the only one we'll really talk about. There's then all the telemetry that is really where the magic of an EDR or AV is really implemented. So this enables it to gather all of the extremely granular telemetry on a Windows system. And so it's going to register, so when you load the CrowdStrike driver, it's going to register with all these different telemetry sources so that it can receive all of the events, it can correlate them, and then it can respond appropriately on that event. So the triumvirate of kind of very common ones are the process thread and image load creation events. And so they're all pretty similar. It's basically an array in the kernel that has a list of pointers to functions to run on one of these events. So CrowdStrike loads, and then it will register in the kernel, and then the function that it wants to run upon a new process creation is going to be added to that array in the kernel. And then you have a new process that's created, the metadata for that, the parent process, the arguments, all that kind of stuff is going to get tracked by CrowdStrike, and then it can look at the command line arguments, make a decision if it's malicious or not, et cetera. And also, that's how, when you're looking in the CrowdStrike console, you can see like process trees and all that kind of stuff, and you can see, you can trace things because it's correlating all that information using that. Same thing with thread creation, so it can detect process injection and different thread operations with that. And then image load notifications. So if you're trying to load in NTDLL to try to bypass user mode hooks, you're trying to remap NTDLL, it can see that image load and call it as malicious and, again, respond appropriately. I'll kind of skip over object manager notifications, but they're a little bit more complex, but basically it's a way that you can, kind of the inverse of that, you can protect a specific process or something. So you can see, hey, a handle was requested for the LSAS process, and then you can track that. So if for some reason you've evaded the process creation, notification callback, and the other things through some method, but you touch LSAS by requesting a handle for it, you can track it that way too. Okay, and then file system mini filters are pretty simple because we all are pretty familiar with that. If you write something to the file, a callback is registered to then do something with it, right? So file read, file write to a named pipe or the file system or something. If you write a file to disk, it can analyze it, it can send it to the cloud to do some AI/ML analysis on it, it can run it in a sandbox, it can look for signatures, all that kind of stuff. And of course, it can scrub it if it doesn't like it. And then event tracing for Windows, that has user and kernel mode components, but the kernel mode components is basically, it can group a bunch of events, and harkening back to our analogy before, it can essentially track things on the server side, right? So if you have a virtual protect call or something like that, if you evade some user mode telemetry detections, at some point it's going to hit the kernel land, and you can track it in the kernel. And some EDRs, like Elastic, for instance, will actually make heavy use of ETW instead of some other mechanisms here. So some EDRs will use more of one type of detection or telemetry source, and then others will use a lot. So actually, CrowdStrike is heavily dependent on the process creation notification callback, heavily dependent on them. And some of them work very similarly. Like I said, Elastic is less dependent on process and is more dependent on ETW. I think MDE is kind of like that too. So yeah, there's a lot more that we won't cover, but the ones that we've talked about thus far, it's going to get you about 95% or more there. So if you attack these telemetry sources in the kernel, you're probably going to be able to do just about whatever you want, at least as a red teamer. So, okay, so how do we attack these EDRs? Again, we're going to skip user mode attacks. Kernel mode attacks, there's basically 3 options that we have, at least that I could think of. Option 1 is find a vulnerability or weaponize a 0 or n-day vulnerability in the Windows kernel or a native driver. So that would be NTOS kernel.exe or something like TCP/IP.sys. There was an IPv6 vulnerability released 6 months ago or something, and nobody could really weaponize a solid exploit for it, but that would be a good example of something that you could leverage. If you could weaponize an exploit for a specific vulnerability, you could then use that natively without having to be an admin or something like that. You could just exploit the vulnerability, enumerate the EDR telemetry, remove it, and do what you need to do. So option number 1 is great, and it's obviously the most powerful. It's also the most difficult. So if you can do that, call me, and I'll do a little, we're not worthy kind of thing, and you can maybe make $1 million if you want to sell it to some shady dark web site or something like that, which I don't recommend. Option number 2, you can write a malicious driver and load it. Has anybody tried to do this before? If you write a driver, you can't just load it, right? So if you go to Visual Studio, you write and compile a kernel driver, and you try to load it on a prod system, it's going to fail because Microsoft has what's called driver signature enforcement, which requires not only an extended validation cert, but also for it to be cross-signed by Microsoft. So these days, if you want to load a kernel driver in prod, you have to submit it to Windows Hardware Quality Labs, and they'll do a bunch of testing, and then they'll give you a yay or nay, and we're actually in the process of doing that at White Knight for our red team engagements, and we're about 3 months in the process at this point. So it's not fun, and obviously, it's not something that like a threat actor would want to submit their rootkit to Microsoft. So anyways, option 3 is what we're really going to focus on today, which is bring your own vulnerable driver, which is we're just going to load a known vulnerable driver or an unknown vulnerable driver on the system and then exploit it to then be able to manipulate kernel memory. So we find a signed vulnerable driver, and then in some way we have developed an exploit for it, and then we enumerate and dismantle it. It does require local admin. That's the biggest downside. So if you find a native driver or kernel vulnerability, you might not need local admin because it's already on the system, it's already loaded, it's already you don't need any special permissions in most cases, with some caveats. But with option 3, you do need local admin privileges to load something in the driver, or like an NT load driver privilege or something like that. But So that's the downside. But if you're a red teamer or a pen tester, you are probably well aware that it's not an uncommon situation that you find yourself with local admin, and then you're really frustrated because you have local admin, but you can't get your malware on the system still because you're fighting the EDR. Okay, so weaponizing vulnerabilities. So what are we looking for with kernel vulnerabilities? We're looking to get read-write in the kernel. So it's a little bit different than your traditional exploit development. A lot of times in exploit development, you're looking to run arbitrary code. We don't care about running arbitrary code. A lot of times you use read-write access to get to the stage where you're running arbitrary code. But really, we just want read-write. That's all I care about. I just want to look at memory in the kernel and manipulate it if needed. I don't need to have a token swapping shellcode or something run. We don't need that. So, oops. Skipping the techniques and going to the vulnerabilities real quick. Usually that's an arbitrary read or write. So if you have an arbitrary mem copy, mem move, that type of thing, that's going to be really powerful. An arbitrary increment or decrement can be weaponized into read-write with a little bit of work. And then callback function overwrites, physical memory mapping, those types of things are the type of vulnerabilities that at least I'm looking for when I'm looking at driver code. The techniques that we can use to get, for instance, an arbitrary increment or decrement to arbitrary read-write is something like the previous mode. So this is remediated in 24H2, but in previous versions of Windows, there's in the K thread, which is the kernel mode representation of a thread, there's an attribute called previous mode, and it's basically tracking whether or not it's a user mode thread or a kernel mode thread. So we find our kernel thread object, and then we manipulate previous mode to say, hey, I'm a kernel thread, not a user thread, and then it will let you read and write to kernel mode, which is pretty awesome. It only works on some versions of Windows at this point because 24H2 you'll get a bug check if that happens. There's a couple others, but I don't have time to talk about them all. So basically, as a summary, load the driver, exploit it to get read-write, enumerate the EDR telemetry, remove it. And then optionally add it back in right at the end. So you could run a payload, for instance, and then restore the telemetry. And that would be a lot stealthier because then the operating system or the EDR will actually see future events, and so to speak. So I liken this to, so I'm American, right? So I'm from Pittsburgh. Americans like Nicolas Cage, and they like the Declaration of Independence, right? So if you've seen National Treasure, there's a scene where he's stealing the Declaration of Independence, and he's running through a hallway with it, and his compatriot has looped the feedback, the surveillance feed, so that it's just the guys in the security center are just looking at an empty hallway. But he's actually running away with the Declaration of Independence. So that's essentially what we're doing here. We're looping the feed for the EDR, so it's seeing situation normal, right? But we're running away with the goods. Okay, so we're going to do a quick demo here. Okay. Hold on a second. Trying to make this bigger. Okay. That's about all we got. All right, so we have a system with CrowdStrike Falcon running, just kind of default. And we have a share that we're going to copy unobfuscated. This is just downloaded from GitHub Mimikatz. And we're going to download it to the desktop. So this is like the most common malware, right, ever at this point, probably. I don't know, I'm just guessing. And so I'm copying it to the desktop, and you see CrowdStrike's going to scream at us in the bottom right. So we got caught, of course, and that's a little bit of a combination between the file system mini filter, right, that saw the file write to the desktop, and then also the process creation notification callback. So, you try to start Mimikatz, it's going to see Mimikatz in the command line, and, it's going to scream at us. So the next thing that we're going to do here, hopefully this is big enough so you guys can see it, but we're going to use a Microsoft tool, ProcDump, which is part of sysinternals. Well, it's Microsoft's. And we're going to use it to dump LSAS, right? So this is an LOL, leaving off the land tool, right? It's not malicious, it's not malware, but we're going to use it for malicious purposes, and CrowdStrike's going to scream at us again. It sees proc dump in that process creation notification event, and it also sees LSAS, and then it kills it, because it's like somebody's trying to dump LSAS, that's bad, right? And sorry, I know we're moving really fast through this, but we don't have a lot of time. So now we're just looking at the kernel driver that is loaded, the vulnerable kernel driver, and the service is running so we can interact with it. And then we'll see we're running an exploit here. It's a custom exploit that uses that previous mode technique. And we have to run it a couple times, but basically it's writing null data to the kernel. That's the nature of the vulnerability. And so starting off, it just removes the process notification callback by zeroing it out for CrowdStrike. And then we run it again, and then we can enable that previous mode to impersonate a kernel thread and read and write to kernel data. And then we just enumerate all of this telemetry. So you can see, WD filter, that's for Windows Defender. Even though it's not active, it's still loaded. So we just remove Windows Defender and CrowdStrike, and then it's starting to enumerate the file system mini filters, which is a little bit more complex. It's a lot of kind of like reading pointers and then dereferencing them and all that kind of stuff. You have to be very careful. I've blue-screened many boxes developing these tools, so you have to be very careful before you run it in prod and do lots of testing. But yeah, so at this point, it's essentially removed all of the telemetry we talked about in the talk. And then at the end, it's elevating PPL status and we can organize it in Process Explorer and see that our malware process is actually running as a higher PPL than CS Falcon there. And so if it wanted to try to kill it, unless it does it from the driver, it's not going to work. So what did that do? Now we can rerun the same techniques. Really basic stuff, right? This is OSCP level stuff. We're just copying over Mimikatz and dumping LSAS. We're starting with proc dump, but we can see we get our EULA and we get a dump no problem, and we don't see anything from CrowdStrike. It's just yawning at this point. It doesn't notice it. And then again, we paste in Mimikatz here, and to the tools directory, it again yawns. It doesn't care because it's not doing anything. The CrowdStrike functions aren't being run when we do a file write. And then we run it, and we do our privilege debug in Secure LSA, log on passwords, and we get all of our goods. So that's the end of the demo. And the last part is, pray from current slide. The last part is just blue team notes. So how do we detect and prevent this? It's pretty difficult because a lot of this, for instance, the driver used here is an unknown vulnerable driver. So it's not commonly known. That's why I'm not releasing it, because I don't want any ransomware actors to start using it. But basically, you find an unknown vulnerable driver, something that's not tracked or known, weaponize an exploit, and then dismantle the EDR. So restricting local admin access will do wonders, right? It's just basic security hygiene. Because you need local admin to load a third-party driver. So that's a major thing that you can do to defend against this. And patch and vulnerability management for those end days, if you have a vulnerability in the kernel, those types of things. Then also newer is better. Windows 11 has a lot of protections enabled, some hardware and software protections for the kernel. And also has the vulnerable driver block list enforced. So if there's a ransomware campaign that's using a specific vulnerable driver, it's added to that block list, it's pushed out, and it's no longer, it's not something you can load unless you disable that. And then finally, if you're a SOC, you can write some rules to detect driver load events and kernel service creation. And that's really the last thing that I'll say. It's pretty effective. Actually, I did it with a SOC a year or so ago, and it was pretty great. So yeah, that's it. Thanks, everybody.